Welcome to Radio Tipping Point. And as we are constantly trying to explore different avenues and how we approach the show, I feel especially blessed today to have Hunter Hilinski coming out of Irvine, California, who is a PhD student in political science from the University of California at Irvine. And our subject today is relations, alienations, and transformations. Hunter, thank you very much for joining us. And the first question that I would have would be based upon these three concepts that you have asked to be the focus of the show. Perhaps if you can give us an idea of what the impetus was. Where did you come up with your inspiration to talk about these three very distinct concepts?
Yeah, thanks, Mike. It's really great to be here. So, yeah, I mean, this is through I've come to these ideas and these questions through a long journey through undergrad and grad school, and I've been reading about alienation a lot more lately because I've been interested in this question of sort of living in a post-revolutionary age, or in an age where this sort of idea of a radical transformation of society is seen as being impossible or questionable at best. And so I've been thinking more about the effects that has, and this comes from a sort of long line of people that have inspired me, people like Mark Fisher, Herbert Marcuse, Karl Marx, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. It goes the sort of long history here to this tradition. But especially, I started to notice, I've taught a lot of classes over the years. And I think it's important for educators to tap into that experience in the classroom when we're trying to figure out what it is we want to research and what it is we want to write about and talk about. I think things that relate to our students well should give us some impetus to maybe follow that feeling. And so every time I teach Marx, I talk about his theory of different types of alienation. This goes back to his earlier works and his Paris manuscripts of 1844. And I noticed that every time I was talking about these ideas in Marx, my students would sort of turn on a little bit more. They were a little bit more attentive. They were paying attention a little bit more. And and they were more responsive. They were talking more in class. They were more interested than if we were talking about, his theory of history or a different thinker entirely. And I think it's interesting that they seem to relate most to this idea of feeling alienated when it itself is a feeling of a sort of lack of relation. And so they sort of related to this idea of not feeling certain types of relations. They related to this idea of being distanced or separated from something that they felt was fundamental. And I think that's interesting. And I wanted to pursue that more. I still don't think there's been a systematic idea of alienation that's been developed, like a coherent theory. Not that we need a theory of everything, but yeah, so it sort of led me, and my students were sort of instrumental in leading me to that. And I think looking more at these ways that we can feel powerless or relationless, I think pointing those out can be a sort of bridge to generating new theories or new ideas of action and new types of action and new movements towards transforming society in a sort of fundamentally different way. So yeah, that was some of the inspiration that got me to where I am.
There's a subject I keep coming back to quite often, and being involved in the sector myself and understanding all too well the difference of what I found from the students prior to the pandemic and during the pandemic and post-pandemic, which were primarily an attenuation or a turbocharging, if I can phrase it as such, of those tendencies that were already to be found within the within the populace, tied to the attention economy, tied to the dysfunction of communication, tied to this idea of social media being anything but social, and we already know these concepts, so don't need to rehash any of these points. But the real question, what I'd be really keen on, is what bridge do you build to that political being, either from the individual or from the collective, tied to all of these components? That would be very interesting for me.
Mm. Yeah, there's a couple different angles you could take. And I think social media is a great example. It's one of the things I talk about with my students too, because it brings up this question of, how have we continued to create these new ways of connecting ourselves to each other and to news, and yet those same exact things that seem to connect us are exactly what make us feel the most distanced. It's tough, and so you have to approach the individual and the collective in different ways, I think, or approach them from different angles to see where they sort of connect to one another. So I mean, the ideas in alienation theory are sort of long. There's different people who point to the origins of where these ideas began. One of the things, at least I subscribe to, and I think one of the things that connects Marx and Marcuse, is this idea that alienation is a historical phenomenon. For both Marx and Marcuse, alienation actually is something that starts with the rise of industrial modernity. It's not something that existed before the rise of capitalism, essentially. And so I think to sort of give it this historical specificity, that it is a product of certain types of systemic economic, political relations that have grown with modern capitalism. It allows you to see it not only as something that's specific to a certain historical moment, but something that's historically malleable, something that we could change. And this was something that's central to Marcuse's whole project. Which brings up the question now, right? So with social media, I think just the pace of everyday life is like crazy. I mean, the rise of burnout, the rise of anxiety, the rise of hyperactivity, right? These are all products of certain sort of historical iterations of relations that I think we need to be able to place alienation into in a different way. So it always needs to be reformed, because I think these things are always changing. They're accelerating or slowing down, or creating new tensions in places we didn't see before. Like who could have foresaw all of the effects that the internet would have on us in the 1970s or 1980s. So we always have to try to give historical credence, or try to explain it in terms of a sort of certain type of history that we are sort of wrapped in. And that's one of the difficult things, is we're very much part. It's hard to see what's happening and sort of take a step back at the same time to try to understand. You can sort of get swept up in it and lost in it. So yeah, there's been some really interesting recent work that tries to make an argument that social movements, especially in the post-Occupy, post-Arab Spring, and more recently Black Lives Matter, that these represent a sort of collective embodiment, this sort of coming together of individual bodies in this collective space, that like redefines what it sort of means to occupy or to cohabitate in a space together. And so, do I think that social movements are like the cure to alienation? No. But I think they offer this potential for sort of redefining what it means to occupy a space with other people who share a sort of common aspiration. And so, yeah, there is this relationship between individual and whole, or individual and collective. it's just trying to find those bridges. It's tough.
We go wherever the conversation takes us, but there's one thing that came to mind while you were describing those various movements, and to what degree we can look at those as being milestones in some fashion. But there's a word that we have in German that's used in English, although probably because we don't have a comparable word in English, is called Weltschmerz. And within this concept of Weltschmerz, I'm going to, for lack of a better description, I'm going to call it a collective empathy that we have, because this is a condition or a feeling that we have as a group towards the whatever that condition or that situation might be. And so the question would be, when we are looking at dealing with the question of alienation, looking at where this this path is taking us, do you find that there is more of a collective, not in a well-being, the collective consciousness? Do you find that we're gearing more towards some sort of collective consciousness? And then there's a corollary to my question, and is this something natural, or is this something manipulative?
Actually, the second question is the more difficult one.
I know, that's why I saved it for the last.
Yeah, thank you. To the first question, I would say, if we're talking about alienation, and part of my project will have to be laying out a sort of lit review of different approaches to it. Like, right, this sort of, there has been a long history of approaches to this question. All of the approaches so far, up until some more recent work by people like Jason Delgandio is a professor at Temple. His work is really amazing. He wrote a book called Rhetoric for Radicals, a handbook for 21st century organizing. So he's really sort of wed to this question of the collective, right? And the question of alienation, and the question of what sort of impels us to come together and assert a sort of common objective for refashioning society in a more egalitarian or radical vision. It's always been approached from the perspective of like a Western dominated conception of reason, right? Like this Cartesian duality that the mind is separate from the body, and and it's become sort of commonplace now and common sense to approach things in this way. But I think when you're talking about something like alienation, and I was watching one of your older videos on burnout, where you were talking to two women about burnout. They talked about this sort of heaviness that they felt, right? And some of the more recent work when approaching alienation is trying to overcome this dualism between mind and body. Because if you really sit back and think about it, the body reflects directly so many of the things that we feel. I mean, that weightlessness that you feel, that jitteriness that you feel, that's an expression of conscious sensations or conscious feelings. Actually, a lot of them are unconscious too, which is a bit of a different rabbit hole. So what people like Delgandio and others talk about is this need to emphasize responses to alienation as a type of embodiment, that the mind and the body really aren't that separate, and that actually what the mind really does is it works to categorize all of its sort of inputs and sensations and feelings. So for example, your eyes have 100 million nerves that receive light, and cells and receptors, but they have to boil those down into 1 million nerves that translate that light to your brain. And so the whole body is an action, or this sort of organism of categorization, of minimalization, of diffusion. And they try to see parallels between these sort of neural and conscious components of the body and the more physical components of the body, and how that relates to the social functions and social relations that engender certain feelings. So I think, we need to look at the ways that we relate through more felt or sensual or erotic means than just these sort of detached and very distant ideas that reason can step back and understand everything. Reason is very much implicated in the emotions of the body itself. And so I think for them, when it comes to social movements, these are sort of collective erotic moments where sort of the space between bodies becomes redefined, and they become dependent on these very sensual radical redefinitions of what it means to feel and what it means to be. And so, yeah, I think more open approaches. This brings in a lot of indigenous scholarship and critical race scholarship that I think is important in the question of alienation, because it has been, I think, like Western society, been dominated by this duality, and maybe not so much a sort of dialectic.
You know where this path is going to take us in this conversation, because you're getting into the essence of a lot of the things that we talk about here on Radio Tipping Point. And one of them is this idea of Western thought tied to individualism, and to what degree all those things that you talked about were very much outputs of something that was very much a cultural input that we're not cognizant of. I wouldn't call it subliminal, because that would almost be intentional, but it's something that's always to be found on the surface. And in fact, it's a road that we really don't want to go down to. And to follow up on that, looking at that estrangement, and that's a conscious choice. It's a conscious choice that we're making within the Western world, because that's much more predictable, isn't it? If we remove the emotional and we keep it totally on the so-called rational, then that means that the predictive nature of what we're working towards is our chances of hitting a bullseye become much larger, right? So following that of what you're talking about, the real danger is letting things go and letting them develop as they would develop, because that is almost contrary to the way that the last 400 years have worked within Western thought, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think it opens more avenues for spontaneity. I mean, this question of individuation is really central, I think. And it gets to some of the critiques of current alienation studies. So like, I think of someone, Eric Fromm. Fromm talks so much about how in the process of becoming individual, you sort of have a choice. In some ways, you can either join in the world in spontaneity and love, or you can sort of fear the danger that freedom represents, that spontaneity gives you, and you could submit your freedom to forces of domination, because for him there is this sort of maybe almost unconscious fear of being truly, genuinely free. And so, which is to say that the process of becoming an individual is a hugely traumatic endeavor. It's a very difficult thing to do. And yeah, I think when you're talking about this process of individuals becoming something much larger in a collective or in a social movement, you need strong individuals. Now, one of the problems with Fromm is that he sort of holds on to the idea that there is this human nature, that there's this essence. And I think this is something Marx holds on to when he talks about alienation, right? So for Marx, alienation hurts you in four ways. It separates you from the product of your labor. Imagine you're on like a factory line, right? And you're making cars for Henry Ford. You don't feel like your labor is directly tied to the doors that you keep putting onto these cars as they roll by. You're distant from the product, you're distant from the worker, you're distanced from yourself and alienated from yourself, and you're alienated from what he called your species being, from your sort of essence as a human. That's something Fromm, 80 some years later continues. And a lot of the discourse now is this sort of difficulty, can we really say that humans have an essence? Can we really say that there is something deep in our inner core that sort of connects us all universally? I'm not sure, but I think that might be one of the areas of Western thought that we need to move away from. This sort of like essentialism or this universalism. There have been some attempts. We can talk more about those, about ways, because I'm critiquing those attempts, because I think there's better ways to get beyond this. So for me, then the question doesn't come down to this essence that we are pulled away from or taken out of. It simply comes down to feeling like we are living a life that is our own, and feeling like we're living a life with others that is sort of dependent on mutual community and relations of reciprocity and love and spontaneity. So it's a question of relations then, which is one of the words that we said that we would talk about. It's then not a question of an essence, but a question of what connects us in the everyday, and how do we sort of operate with each other? How do we move with each other and think with each other? And yeah, I think that's central to this problem of thinking about how the individual develops in Western society, in an increasingly alienated society, and that's a very traumatic endeavor.
I was going to ask one question, but I've decided to change it to something else. I was going to ask you about to what degree does this all fall within Maslow's level 2 security? Because I think there's a clear correlation between that of what you're talking about. But your point number 4 from is probably the most important thing, and it's one that I struggle with a little bit today, because I don't know if this is a Western concept or not. But it's all tied to this idea of autonomy and mastery, because that when that tied to what was taking place when Marx was in his prime back in 1844, and everything that was taking place around the Industrial Revolution, we were capable of doing everything. In other words, we would go from the beginning to the end of whatever we were producing. We had a clear identification with those things that we were producing. And then we reached a point of where the employer would say, oh, that's great, you could do 10 things, but I only need you to do one. And so that alienation that you're talking about really started there at that point. But I'd like to concentrate on point number 4, because if you believe that this is a need that human beings have tied to their sense of purpose, that they could do things on their own based upon whatever they learned, and so this whole trial and error, whatever it may be, and I do believe there's something universal about that. And this question of mastery, that you've not only are you able to do things, but you feel that you are progressing in some fashion. And I think there's a clear correlation between not only Western thought, but there's a concept coming from Japan called suhari. You're familiar with it? Okay, where
I'm just
I can elaborate. No worries. Under su, that means you know nothing, and so you're just kind of following the manual. When you get to the ha stage, you are willing to experiment a little bit, but when you get to the re stage, you don't need the manual, because you're just doing everything instinctually. And so when I think about this need that we have, and I believe truly this is a need that we have within the Western world of autonomy and mastery. And when I think about suhari, then I think there is perhaps something out there that is a commonality, which is a universal concept. And I do believe that it's tied to point number 4. Now that was a big package that I just tossed in your direction, Hunter. So I don't know how you'd like to go ahead and take that one on.
No, I think it's a question that will remain. It makes me, use the word needs. This is something that both Fromm and Marcuse talk so much about. They, they both disagree on a lot, for sure. They had their falling out, and there's a lot different in their works. But I think one thing that ties them together is this question of need. And I think it goes beyond the question of these sort of universal needs, right? Like, we all need to be fed and clothed and housed. And plenty of the world doesn't even have those very basic needs. When we get beyond those, both Marcuse and Fromm remained wed to this notion of a true need, and they defined them in different ways. So Fromm moved. Their big disagreement, for any of those who are nerds like me and who care, is Fromm moved away from Freud's metapsychology. He did not subscribe to this instinctual, this sort of timeless instinctual battle between Eros and Thanatos, life and death. That's something Marcuse kept. Marcuse sort of remained wed to this notion of the instincts. Fromm moved to more relational psychology. But they both say that there are certain genuine or true needs that the human individual needs, like sort of relatedness, to feel loved would also be a need. But then you run into all these difficulties and how to define those and exactly what they look like. And I think I'm not quite ready to say that there is a sort of universal, true, genuine need, that beyond those basic needs, at least until, there's what, I might be wrong, but there's about 600,000 homeless people in the United States. To say that their basic needs being fulfilled are tied in other ways to these other needs of love and relatedness and spontaneity, they might be deeply related. But I think people still need their bread and shelter before we can talk about these genuine social needs of love and spontaneity. And I think a project that solves that would obviously be based on love, and must be. I have a good example, as I think there's like a world summit or something in San Francisco.
Taking place now, I believe.
It's taking place now, yeah. And so I heard that Gavin Newsom, they're essentially cleaning up the streets of San Francisco, and there's no homeless people there right now because they all got moved somewhere else. And then when the summit's over and all these world leaders are gone, I almost cursed, and all these world leaders are gone, all the homeless people will just come back. And think about the resources devoted to making San Francisco appear to be this very habitable and civilized and awesome place, when it's really just sort of masking these daily horrors that so many people experience, and then they just come back. And so we need to sort of radically change the way that, I think in America, especially when it comes to something like homelessness, it's become just a general part of the way that we view society. It's no longer, we're almost numb to it. And so this gets at, again, the difficulty of those different types of needs. And I'm still not ready to defend this universal, genuine, true, biological, instinctual need. But it shows you how difficult the fulfillment of food and shelter and clothing, it's also deeply tied to a rekindled sense of love and affection and cohabitation and community. So it's really difficult, but these are things that we need to talk about. I don't know how to solve them politically. That's why I'm not a politician. I'm also too handsome to be a politician. I teach because I think educating is how I can contribute to these discourses. But I think we could and should be doing more. And I think it's really important to be able to say that and to continue saying that.
And I'm going to go piggyback on a bunch of different things that you said, Hunter, being the anti-Cartesian as I am, and believing that there is no such thing as dualism because that's a Western alternative fact. Then I would argue that you can still look towards that universalism but not as an absolute, but it's all in relation. Now I'm going to piggyback on one of your words. It's in relation to these other concepts. And without even really planning it, you brought us back to Maslow anyways, because you were talking about his hierarchy of needs. At the top of this pyramid, it's almost like the holy grail that we don't feel that we'll ever really get to, is that self-realization, also piggybacking on from. But I think that within this alienation, that if we were to put things on a scale, and on one side you would have the ultimate individualism, which in my mind is represented by the United States, and on the other side, it's almost like the corollary is that alienation that comes through because there is no there's no glue holding the whole thing together, or if there is something that's holding it together, it's in spite of all the conditions that you find that are leading us all in this direction. And then I think it would be quite useful to look at how that, in your mind, how that relation is between the alienation and the basis, which would be the relations.
No, these are good questions. I mean, yeah, this crazy individualism of America, it's so baked into the fabric of this country. And I think, you can understand historically why that is. The way that it's sort of manifested today, I think, is negative for the most part. My partner's from Germany, and she's a PhD student here. But she is amazed at just simple things like the eating culture here in America. Like, most people eat alone, or will eat fast food on the go because we're always working. And right, I mean, fast food grew here so much because of this sort of this individual like productivity ethos of overwork. And I have friends even in this program who we're all burdened by deadlines and stuff, but they've been responding to the stress of those deadlines by like shutting themselves in and not hanging out with us anymore. And so I think there's something deep here where we always revert because of these social pressures and these really alienating. I don't think I've ever experienced more alienation than I have at the University of California, Irvine. It's a very alienating place, and I think it's part of what's made it grow for me, is to see the ways that higher education is. I don't think it's specific to Irvine. I think plenty of schools.
It's not.
One would feel this way, and I'm very privileged to be able to do what I do and get paid to study and teach and learn. So I'm not complaining, but yeah, we have this way of kind of turning inwards. And I think that's really baked into the fabric of American culture. How those relations would shift or change. I mean, there's been some interesting work on this. I think especially the climate crisis and the sort of ecological crisis that we're facing collectively as a planet is creating new discourses on like re-envisioning the function of borders, re-envisioning what it means to live in a community that's sort of struck by a common precarity, which is natural disaster. I think it's making us more attuned to the sort of rhythm of life and the rhythm of the earth, because I think that rhythm has been fundamentally altered by capital and by industry. Like I said earlier, it's been accelerated, and that acceleration, I think, it's important not to romanticize the earth or nature in these ways, but I think we see the earth as responding to those rhythms in its own way. And that's a product of human action. And so we need to rethink what it is that we're doing. And so, when we met last week, we talked about Kate Soper. Kate Soper argues for this alternative hedonism, which is to see. So it is a type of hedonism, right? But her argument is that even if we could continue this process of individual consumption infinitely and endlessly in the West as much as we wanted, it would not make our lives happier. Even if we could do that with no environmental effects, we would not be happier. We have to see collectively that what will make us happy is like a bit of a slowing down, of maybe coming back to the basics or coming back to community, and not placing all of our happiness in consumption and in work, and in sort of reaffirming the alienating relations of our life, thinking that that is the only response that we have to them. I think we're trying to create new conditions of possibility. That's a phrase that I use a lot in my work. So yeah, I think that becomes central, that we have to try to revision what kind of things would make us happy, and what it would mean to be happy. But I don't
and
even know if
that's the road we don't want to go down very often, because we're almost afraid of all the wrong turns that were either inflicted on us or that we made due to some false promises or whatever it may be. I mean, that's where some individuals, especially you're getting closer to my age, they might think, well, the whole thing was for the birds.
Well, and you know, one of my big critiques too of alienation studies in general is, you know, there are these important focuses on the individual and the collective, which I think need to be maintained. What I haven't seen, and it's interesting that people like James Baldwin, Fred Moten, Sylvia Wynter, Saidiya Hartman, they express a condition, and right, this is the Black radical tradition, and the condition of Blackness in the sort of post-chattel slavery era. They express this type of alienation that is, I think, so fundamentally different from the one that Marx or Marcuse or Fromm gets at. But they rarely use the word alienation. And so one of my claims is that what alienation studies fails to do is to consider the other. It's sort of almost preoccupied with the self in some ways. Or, you know, I think there's ways that the collective could be fashioned in a way that includes the other. But I think this fundamental question of the other, which in you know, the work of the people I just mentioned is Blackness, could really add something, especially in America, where, you know, as we know, police brutality, racial relations are still at this terrible level of fracture. So I think that's something we need to also think about when we're building community projects, when we're thinking about individual relations or individuation as a social process. We have to think about the other, and I think Western thought is dependent on the continual creation of that other. I think that's something we've seen play out in the Middle East. And so I think that becomes central to my work in some ways. How that looks, I'm still working on it. But I think these are the questions that haven't been asked, and I think they need to.
Yeah. I tend to think the police brutality in the like is more the symptom, because that's the end result of something that's much more deep-seated. And it's quite interesting that you talk about Baldwin and co., because I believe that James Baldwin would actually throw it back in our face and say, how do you know that you're not Black? How do you know I'm not white? Because there's been such a mixture through the years, and that was not necessarily always freely chosen. Very often that was somewhat determined. And at the end, if you cannot answer the question whether you're Black or white, then it doesn't necessarily make the question irrelevant, but it compels you to look at that question from a totally different perspective. And what is the question that we're actually asking? Isn't a question more of mindset and understanding? And I'm going to bring it back to this question of alienation, because even if they're not talking about it if they don't use the word alienation. One thing is quite clear in Baldwin's work, that he would say, you don't understand, you cannot understand. So is that not alienation?
Not in the Marxian sense, but I think that's what's most interesting about it. And I shouldn't say interesting, because it's still a sort of visceral lived experience for so many people. You know, I think to feel alienated, when we talk about systemic injustice, that is maybe that is the source that contributes to this product of alienation for so many people. These are conversations that I have with others more attuned to this tradition. I mean, I read a lot of these works, but it's hard to put that into my own field of experience, because I don't experience it. I'm white, right? And so this is where me and my work, I rely on others. I rely on friends and experts and conversations that I have with others who are more attuned to this direct type of experience. But I think we can't be, you know, we can't be so quick to lose the sort of radical, maybe Marxist, if you want to use that word, but this radical orientation towards material organizing, towards a material politic, towards an actual restructuring of those relations. The problem is that those debates now are mostly done in theory. They're not done in practice. And I think that's one of the difficulties now of genuinely organizing, to try to sort of refashion or rearticulate certain relations that might cause alienation. It's becoming increasingly difficult to do these things politically and to organize politically. And that's tough.
Which is really interesting, because the dichotomy of that, of what you just said, in comparison to some other observations that you had earlier, and I'm going to go back to the chain, Arab Spring, Black Lives Matter, collective consciousness, and then when you were talking about the climate change, or the climate crisis, I felt that you were talking about something very similar, that you were referring to some sort of collective consciousness, which meant, and that's what kind of triggered off this word for me, the Weltschmerz, because that's really what it is, which is almost like a direct contradiction to those things that describe our current state of affairs, which means that we have it's even worse of a polarization than I realized. And so, Hunter, I thank you for that, because we talk about polarization as being, you might have an opinion, I will have a different opinion. We have no ability to really understand the other side due to the lack of empathy, the lack of perspective, the lack of being able to view things from the eyes of the others, whatever it may be. But on the same time, we're saying we have this collective consciousness. And I do believe that you are right in this description of the collective consciousness. Isn't that a contradiction?
A contradiction, maybe. I mean, let's focus more on this collective consciousness and ecological disaster, because I think this is really going to be the thing that sort of impels it, if there is one.
I'm an anti-Cartesian, so I have no problems in living with contradictions. So I just want to state that.
No, and when you talk about collective consciousness, it's interesting too, because the growth of panpsychism has really sort of fundamentally rattled the Cartesian duality of mind and body. People like Philip Goff, his work's really interesting, and Rupert Sheldrake, who is a brilliant, wacky man. I really love his work. I recommend people check it out. But if anything, if people still aren't yet willing to jump on this collective consciousness, if they're not as quick to their anti-Cartesianism as you, Mike, I think they might still be able to say that the threat of climate change poses universal risks to everyone in the globe. Are they felt equally? I don't think so, because if you look at charts that chart the sort of predictive flow of climate refugees in the next couple years, predominantly those refugees come from the global south. And so even though we can say it's a universal experience because it's something that is going to be global, and it'll be universal in the sense that we all experience it because we all live on this earth, it proportionally felt much differently by individuals in the global south. And so this is where things like border studies become really fundamental, because there's a scholar, his name's Michael Parenti, and he talks about the border as a site. He calls it the politics of the armed lifeboat, that these climate refugees, and I just think about the problem with refugees now, and their reception in Western countries, the growth of hate crimes throughout Europe and America. Now imagine this multiplied by hundreds and millions, right? He says that rather than sort of changing the fundamental view of the border as the representation of sovereignty, the border is going to be reinforced with militarized means, with soldiers, it's like being in a lifeboat and someone's trying to get in and you're like, we don't have the food for you, stay out. He says that's what countries will essentially become as the climate crisis grows. That's the danger that the border poses. And so there's going to be so many people who will sort of experience this danger, this violence, something that I think Arendt gets right. One of the things that she gets right in talking about statelessness and the dangers of statelessness, they will lose their humanity because they will have no other place to go. And so, but
I don't think we're talking about future state, Hunter. I think we're talking about current state. We're talking about certainly if I was looking at it in Europe, since the refugee stream that hit us in 2015, and the payoff that we have to Turkey to keep 2 million Syrians locked up into Turkey, and the problems we've had in Lampedusa for I think about 20 years now. And there's a clear correlation between the challenges to be found tied to global warming in the global south and this in the lack of possibilities, the lack of possibilities, the lack of perspective that people in the global south have, which leads them to jump into a dinghy to cross into the Mediterranean to get to some place that has to be much better than what they left. So, and I would argue also within the border to be found in the United States that there's probably a fair amount that is not just. How do you make a differentiation between climate conditions and economics? I think they're joined at the hip, aren't they?
I mean, they are. I mean, I think it's this ethos of infinite growth and infinite accumulation that has propelled this growing climate crisis. I think that's what someone like Kate Soper is trying to get at the heart at. For her, it's being able to change our habits of consumption is sort of paramount for being able to change this ethos of infinite accumulation that dominates. I mean, capital is dependent on it. It always has to find a new market. It has to define a new sector. It always has to sort of grow and consume in different ways. I mean, that's the economic system that we're dependent on. That's its number one calling card. And so, yeah, the current condition of the ecological state of the world is deeply tied to capitalism, right? In almost every way. It's harder to get down into then the conditions of possibility that creates for people in the global north versus the global south. It's much easier for us to continue with business as usual because we might not notice the effects as much. And so it becomes difficult to sort of outline a way to act, or a way to sort of refashion or re-envision society in an ecologically conscious way, when all that we know is consumption and growth and accumulation. There's a book by Carl Kassegaard, Towards a Critical Theory of Nature. And in the opening pages, one of the things he talks about is Hegel's definition of measure. So to put it, very simply, so like if I pull a hair from your head, you're not going to be bald, right? You're still going to have hair. If I continue to do so, it might still not be noticeable for a while, but at some point I'm going to pull the last hair and you're going to be bald, right? And so for Hegel, or if you cut down a tree in the forest, you're right, it's still a forest. At what point is it no longer a forest? And so for Hegel, and the way Carl Kassegaard sort of outlines this, is that for Hegel, the catastrophe is sort of laced along every single one of these steps. It's laced on every single tree that is cut, but you don't realize the catastrophe fully until the last tree is cut down. And then you realize that the catastrophe has always been there. And so for Kassegaard, this sort of explains our current condition, that we think we can continue producing and consuming without any side effects or consequences until something happens, the forest is gone, or we're bald, right? To use my, and then we realize that the catastrophe has been there all along. And so I think we need to realize our complicity. Like there needs to be a sort of growing awareness. And that's difficult to cultivate, especially in the global north.
Well, in fact, there's another common thread to be found within our conversation, and this idea of predictability, and the reason why we prefer to keep all that gooky emotionalism out of the way, because we cannot predict. Not only we cannot predict how things are going to turn out, but even worse than that, Hunter, I would say we cannot predict how we are going to react, and that's the thing that we're really the most afraid of. That's the thing we're most afraid of. But to follow that analogy, there are a couple things I could raise, but I'll try to keep it short because I want to get to the transformation part of our conversation. Right. The part of the issue is tied to this linear approach that we believe that everything is to follow a solid line, which obviously, if we're looking at this concept of growth, which means you keep just going up. But in reality, nature is cyclical. And so following that of what you were talking about, the real problem is that we cannot define how this model is supposed to be regenerative. In fact, it's a total disconnect if we're working within this linear confines, which is actually a structural problem. It's a mental problem, it's a cultural problem, and it's a structural problem, all three of them. And I'm not going to say which came first. I think it all ties together. But the real issue is that we are no longer capable of understanding the regenerative component that needs to be part of that, so that we can actually solve the problem as such before it actually gets to that point. That would be one part of the equation. But when I think about the issues that we have tied to understanding that, and I'm going to get to the transformation part, that we've come up with structures that allowed for people to have certain power and money that it's not in their interest to make any changes to that model that continues to where we say more is better, instead of actually removing this concept of sufficiency, which is really what we should be striving for. It's not in these people's interest. So taking the three pillars of our conversation today, the relational, the alienative, and then of course the transformational. How does that transformational actually come into the picture then, in your mind?
I think it certainly ties back to this emphasis on the collective. I mean, I think that has to be at the core of it. Certainly, we need healthier individuals, and we need, better individuals in setting up the social services that might be able to accomplish that, which means more investment in social social access to mental health. But all of that is really a solution to a structural problem, or it's more like a palliative. It's right. And so this is where people like Soper, and I think people on the left with like left accelerationism, they're all getting at these questions of, we can continue to treat the ailment, or we can try to fundamentally restructure that which creates the ailment itself. And I think getting to that is difficult. I think it begins with things like policy change. I think, I consider myself sort of a thinker in the tradition of the Frankfurt School. I don't consider myself an Arendtian or an Arendt scholar by any means. I think she's really interesting, but I haven't really worked on her much since my thesis. But in this tradition of Frankfurt School critical theory, and critical theory broadly, I think Foucault and Deleuze and Franco Berardi, they all add something to this. But there is no outside. There is no solution that we could just pull from somewhere to bring in. I think any solution will develop imminently from the very conditions of crisis and fracture that currently define our lives. I think those conditions have to be the thing that generates a response, a political, social, cultural response. And I think that's why the Frankfurt School, you're going to hear a bunch of orthodox Marxists saying Marcuse was a CIA operative, and you'll hear a lot of people trying to discredit the Frankfurt School. I think in the present, looking at Habermas's statement on Israel-Palestine, that is very much warranted. I very much don't agree with his statement. And I don't agree with a lot of current Frankfurt School thought, but I think the kernel of Frankfurt School critical theory, back to this first generation of thinkers that I work with, they emphasize the social, political, cultural sort of convergence of crisis and of contradiction, and the structural and the psychological. And so I think any idea of transformation, it has to emerge from within. From within these moments of crisis, they have to be the thing that generates new forms of action, which is why I think social movements are so important, because they're responses to conditions of crisis. And I think, how do we get to a stage where those social movements can have political effects? It comes from policy pressure, from putting pressure on our representatives. Do I want fundamentally different political structures? Absolutely. Do I think those can come about in a nonviolent way? No. Am I opposed to violence? Mostly. I would love these radical changes that I think we see, but I think we also have to realize that they have to come about gradually and from within. And that begins with like real on the ground work. I think it begins with compensating workers enough, with having social services that people can rely on, combined with a political pressure, with a real political pressure. There's a video I saw of a journalist. His name's Aaron Mate. This happened like 2 days ago, but he was sitting across from a senator from Delaware, I think. Maybe not Delaware, but he was pressuring the senator. He was like, "Why did you vote against a ceasefire in Gaza? Why didn't you vote for a ceasefire?" Turns out that politician has received hundreds of thousands of dollars from Israel in campaign funding. So we have to also, part of this political pressure I mentioned is detaching, or is asking the question of whether we can detach politics and democracy from this newfound dependence on on military expenditures, on the growth of military sort of arms and spaces of confrontation and forms of control. I don't think it's possible any longer to I think that's a utopian dream, to think that we can detach democracy from the economy. But I think there's practical ways to approach that issue, so that those who are in charge representing us are not wed to the very constellation of destructive forces that we are fighting against. Because then we're just in this perpetual feedback loop of thinking change is coming, but really nothing does. And we have to realize that we are the source of that change.
I ran across an interesting concept not too long ago, and it was tied to this idea that morality is actually an economic tool to allow us to get to those points that is actually part of the plan. But what I thought was quite interesting in your description, that if we were to follow something that Schumpeter talks about with this idea of creative destruction, which is actually very much nature-based. He's talking about a nature-based solution. That it cannot be revolutionary, because revolutionary is probably about as linear as all those other models that we've been talking about. But if we're talking about something that's regenerative, then that means it's evolutionary. But the idea is, how do you ensure that the evolution goes in a way that is most beneficial for all of us on this planet, than just being the human beings, but the entire environment. And I'll go one step further, for those individuals or those living things that have not quite made it here yet, because we hold a responsibility there too. And so if we were to look at that as being evolutionary on the one side, that we need to be cognizant of this collective consciousness that you referred to a number of times, Hunter, if we're able to be very overt in the direction that we're trying to take things towards. And I think that your points tied to public policy very much go in that direction. Then that means that we're not controlling things, because that's the problem we've had so far. We keep trying to control nature, and we can't control nature, but we can positively steer things in a direction that we know is most beneficial. So we've come to the point of sorry, and I took a little bit more time in that description, but I felt it was very important to come up with this, because I'd be really keen on your thoughts based on those ideas, or my synopsis of that, of what you've been talking about.
No, it's all very interesting, and I like the way you talk about regeneration and evolution. I think moving away from nonlinear forms, these are mostly theoretical exercises, but I think they deeply impact the way that we experience reality. And so I think it's important to do these kind of things that you mentioned. Like it's important for the viewer. It's important to see these things, I think, as ways to try to collectively change the way that we approach the world itself. These aren't just like theoretical hula hoops we're doing, or right. I think these are practical questions in some ways.
For me, they're very tangible. Sorry if I could just quickly interject. These are very tangible elements that we're talking about. These are things that we observe in nature. These are things that we can immediately start doing today. So that we would use theory to help manage the trajectory in a certain direction is one part of the equation, but the actual getting our hands dirty part, which would be very much tied to coming with regenerative practices. Those are things that we don't need to wait for instructions or permission.
No, not at all. And the way that you mentioned that, it makes me think of my a very close colleague of mine. He was the advisor for my thesis that you read, and a lot of his works. I was just reading a paper of his that hasn't been published. Actually, we're sort of working on something together now, but he talks about she's a Potawatomi tribe member. Her name's Robin Wall Kimmerer. Her and Starhawk have sort of they've blown up, but she talks about this idea of gifts, of welcoming the gifts of breath, the gifts of just simple gifts, to see sort of our relationship with the earth as a gift itself, something that requires no ownership. It's hard to say all these things because I feel the Marxists behind me saying, like, shut the hell up. But I think this is, I mean, I'm committed to a project of radical transformation. Like, I'm with those Marxists, but I think we need to take and really entertain and internalize these more radical dimensions that I think indigenous and ecological orientations give us. So yeah, what does it mean? And part of why Dave says that is, there's one of the most important books that's come out on the topic of alienation is Yegi's book, written in 2014, and it's a really good work. But she talks about overcoming alienation and sort of transforming the social and the social and the political. She says that we have to find new ways to appropriate our life. Her idea of appropriation is, it's with this conviction that we have to feel like we are the ones in control of our own lives, that we have to feel like we're living our life, and that we are determining the conditions of that life. That's what, and essentially to feel alienated is to feel like you don't have any control. You're powerless to the forces that determine your life. And so you feel detached from your own life. But she emphasizes this sort of sovereign notion of appropriation dependent on property. Like, you have to make your life your own. You have to seize it and master it. It's all very violent. It sounds violent. She's not violent. She's wonderful. And so I think part of the reason Dave emphasizes gifts is, like, to say that there are certain features of our existence, like the earth and like trees and oxygen and breath, that are gifts that pre-exist the appropriative will, the human subject that tries to appropriate the conditions of their life. There are things that come before us that we have to be sort of attuned to, and to be able to bring into a regenerative project. And so I think being able to see those things as gifts without falling into this, voodoo romanticism is important. Like, I think these are real practical things. I don't think this isn't a romanticism, whatever you want to call that. It's simply true that being able to breathe is a gift. And I think bringing that into a revolutionary project is interesting. I think it's necessary too.
I think the radicalism is directly tied to this estrangement that we have towards those things that are so natural that we've lost touch of. And the interesting part about that, there's so many interesting things that you mentioned right now. But we keep thinking this is a zero-sum game, and it's not. We're not talking about a zero-sum game. We're talking about something that is not transactional, which is the third part of the equation. Not linear. It's not. We're not talking about dualism here, and we're not talking about transactions either. We're talking about something that's just there. And in our biggest estrangement is being able to get our head around that stuff. That's where our real estrangement is to be found. Hunter, I think we've reached the end of what I could put into 57 minutes. So I'd like to thank you very much for your time. And I'm not quite sure where you were hoping this conversation to go, but I found it extremely enriching, and I thank you for that.